Good afternoon, everybody. Let me welcome you to the Stone Chapel at Lanier Theological Library. We really are honored that you've chosen to spend part of your Friday afternoon with us. And we have a distinguished panel of scholars that will be introduced to you shortly. Can we get the music off? That would be good. All right. I think I'd like to lead us in a prayer to start with, and then we'll introduce our moderator, and he will introduce the others. Let's pray together. God, thank you for a beautiful day. Thank you for a beautiful place to meet in and to talk about important matters. Thank you for these scholars who have come to serve on this panel and to moderate. Thank you so much for their work and for all the ways in which they've contributed to education and growth and enhancement of our knowledge of the past and our anticipation of the future. I thank you for Mark and Becky Lanier and for the generosity that allows us to enjoy such beautiful surroundings and such great resources as we have here. Thank you for these people who have come to learn and enjoy. And bless the fellowship that we have this afternoon and all that is shared here in the panel. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. Mark Lanier couldn't be with us this afternoon. His schedule is too tight, too busy. But as director of the library, my name is Charles Mickey. I get to welcome you and introduce our moderator, Jim Hoffmeier. Jim is we call him a frequent flyer here at the library because he comes often. He's been here beginning in early 2011, I think it was. We opened in October 2010, so that was very close to our opening time. And Jim is a distinguished lecturer for us. He has brought 2 lectures, and both of those are on our website, available to you at any time for you to view and enjoy. Jim is a distinguished professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's called the professor of Old Testament and Ancient Near Eastern History and Archaeology. I wanted to get all those words in the right order, and so I read them. He has numerous books to his credit, articles galore, and I won't try to list all of those, but we have them all. I really do believe we have them all in our library. You could find them pretty easily, maybe getting one of our staff members to help you find them. Jim and Kathy are dear friends to us. Their son Ben is a dear friend, and they've just moved from, they're in the process of retiring. It looks like it's going to stretch out over a year or so, maybe more, but he's semi-retired, I guess we'd say. And they've moved, or they're in the process of moving from Wheaton, Illinois to Paradise, Pennsylvania. So he just drove a truck to Paradise, and he's here to tell us about it. All right. Jim, come and then introduce the other panelists.
Thank you, Charles. I'd like to add my welcome to all of you for being here. This is a great occasion. I love to come to these things because, like many of you, I think it would be fun to see Mark Lanier in court and these panels that he interrogates and cross-examines the witnesses is about as close as I'll get to that. So I'm disappointed I won't get to see him, but I've been watching how he does it, and I think I'm getting the hang of this cross-examining stuff. So let me introduce the panel. Our focus this afternoon will really be dealing with early Christianity in the Middle East, of course. That's where it all began. And some of you think the Bible Belt means this is where it began. But no, that's not the case. It really did begin miles away from here. And there's so much about early Christianity we here in the West do not understand, do not appreciate, and do not realize how much we really are connected. Our roots go back 2,000 years. And so we want to get at some of that today. And so there are a number of experts here with us, and all of them have actually worked on excavations at sites revealing some of the early Christian architecture. So we're going to talk about some of those things this afternoon. And so let me introduce the panelists one by one. And we'll start first with Dr. Tom Davis, who has been here before, participated in other occasions. Tom is an archaeologist, has worked with me in Sinai, now is directing excavations in Cyprus at a late Roman Christian era site. So we'll probably hear a little bit about what Christianity looked like in Cyprus. After all, Paul went there, didn't he, and Barnabas. And Tom is a professor of archaeology at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I'd like to introduce next Dr. Charles Stewart, who is a local from University of St. Thomas here in Houston. And he is an art historian by training, PhD from Indiana University. And he specializes especially in Byzantine and medieval Christian architecture and art. Our distinguished, we're using that word. I was going to say, Charles, that was very nice of you referring to me as distinguished, but I've never had one of those distinguished titles. I thought, I went to my dean and I said, I'm thinking of retiring. And I thought maybe they'd come back and say, well, we'll make you a distinguished this. And you know what they said? He says, great, when do you want to retire? Anyway, this is Darlene Brooks Hedstrom. She is chair of the history department at Wittenberg College in Ohio. I have the pleasure of saying that she was a student of mine at Wheaton College many years ago, and she's done very well in the age department. She looks younger now than she did then. But that's time in the desert. That great hot desert sand on your skin is really good for you. But we're glad she's going to be the keynote speaker tomorrow night, so I hope you're planning to be here for that. And lastly on our panel today, Dr. Mikhail. Magid is a professor of history at the University of California at Fullerton, did his PhD at UCLA. Now, if you're from my neck of the woods, UCLA is the very distinguished way we refer to the university closest to Lambert Avenue, which is the local junior college. But anyway, he's the one in California. So, these are our panelists today, and they do bring various expertises to us. Some of them are working in very different worlds. Tom and Charles work more in the Greek world. Darlene and Magid work more in the African and Egyptian world. So some of the fun we'll have is sort of how these two worlds interface in the same time periods. So we want to look at a number of issues, both in the area of theology, some of the controversies that were going on in the early centuries of the Christian church and how they were resolved, and so on and so forth. They're each mic'd up, so you should be able to hear them quite clearly. I thought it might be good to begin with some theology. Tomorrow's lecture will focus largely on archaeology, but I wanted to start with something in the area of theology. And I want to focus, and we're just going to go right down the line and let each of the speakers take a crack at this. And that is, what would you say in the first several centuries of the Christian church, of course, in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean world, what were the big issues the Christians were wrestling with? Living in a Roman world, living in a Jewish world, living in a somewhat still Hellenistic world. What were some of the issues that Christians were struggling with? Start with Maggie.
Well, thank you for the easy question. It's really a hodgepodge. I mean, there's theological, there's social, there's biblical, which books are in, which
anything you
out.
prefer. Take whichever angle you like.
I mean, one of the things that I find interesting is actually a little bit to the side, which is just simply cultural. You know, one of the things that's just underestimated is just how Christianity brings about a different worldview with regards to the poor, with regards to the relationship with God, with regards to something as simple as how do you pray. You know, one of the Roman prayers is that you kind of get what you deserve. The gods are just, and in their justice they give you what you deserve. So if you end up with something good, it's because you've been good. If you end up with something bad, it's been because you are bad. Within Christianity, this notion of grace, this notion of giving something that isn't inherently earned, is problematic for the wider consciousness of Hellenic and kind of Greco-Roman society. This is one of the things that they kind of struggled with, and you can find it as late as, well, the controversies about the conversion of Constantine, for instance. One of the minor schools of thought is this notion that Constantine does not convert kind of in the traditional date of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, but he converts sometime in right about 224, 220, I'm getting my dates correct, right about 224, so after the murder of his wife and his oldest son, with the idea that is populated, that he goes to all of the pagan priests kind of seeking absolution. He feels guilty for executing his wife and his son, but the Roman priests are refusing. And it's only when he goes to these Christian priests with their forgiveness that he is forgiven and he feels kind of vindicated, and that's why he converts to Christianity. I think one of the things that's not always obvious kind of in the discussions of theology and biblical studies and what have you, just how a radical shift in perception that early Christianity kind of brings into the Roman Empire in general, that's kind of counterintuitive to what people do at the time. And even in the Coptic prayer, it has parallels in other traditions as well, but at one part the congregants pray according to your mercy, not according to our sins. From a strictly Roman perspective, that's just nonsense, because you should get what you deserve.
Very good. Thank you. You want to take a whack at that, Darlene?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things when I'm talking about it with my students that is helpful to kind of create the world of a shifting from a world of many religions to a world in which Christianity is dominant is the intellectual side of it, in terms of thinking about how the school in Alexandria had so many early patristic fathers who are really, I think about them as philosophers who have converted, who are kind of scrutinizing prepositions, and they're talking about what does it mean to have a nature, and is it of the same substance, and how this is broken down so that, for example, when we read the Nicene Creed, it really is a legal contract in many ways, and that this provides us with a way to think about why there would be so much confusion, I think, and questioning in the early church about who's really believing what. And another component I think about often is the fact of illiteracy, and that it's very hard, I think, for modern audiences to think about the early church as a world in which it's a very oral community, and that learning and recitation is so critical to understanding the development of the church and development of correct teachings, and how just by thinking about examples of playing telephone or gossip, that how a story can change, and so how interpretations can change through that oral transmission. And then at the same time, why the written accounts become so important. And so I think that that's something that is fascinating about this time, because it's not an immediate shift. It's something that takes centuries. And that evolution into which we can really get at and say, okay, this population is fully Christianized, is a fairly long process. And I think that thinking about how we know what we know, such as how did early Christians learn the books of the Bible? When did they figure out what books are in the New Testament and how that gets codified? That's a very long process as well. And so I think it was a very exciting time, but I think it also explains why there's some confusion about how does early Christianity actually emerge.
Okay, thank you. Charles, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with these two views. What I usually tell my students is, as Christianity arises in the first 3 centuries, is that there is a cultural crisis, and we have to answer the question, what is culture? And I tell my students, the heart of every culture is the cult. And what is the cult? Well, it's the set of beliefs that everybody in society agrees to. And in the early Roman Empire, there was all these different cultures vying for ideas. And then you had the Roman state that was the metaculture to tie it all together. But there was a lot of conflict between who had the right ideas. And when Christianity arises, the apostles, you read the New Testament, they really focus on that Christianity is historical. There's something that happened in the life of Jesus where the supernatural came down onto the natural world. These things happen at certain places and at certain times, versus the pagan worldview, which was more mythological. So the Christian historical view versus the pagan mythological view, and there's this conflict that's taking place at the time. So in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, I see Christians going to different places saying, this is where Jesus did this miracle. This is a place where the apostles were. And churches would spring up around these different places that mark these historical events. So you could say that Christianity itself, as it arises, there's a historical identity. And I think as archaeologists and scholars here, we wouldn't be here if Christianity didn't tie itself to history like it did.
For me, the historian, I like that. Thank you. Tom?
Well, as primarily an archaeologist, the questions that I see the early church and Christians wrestling with are very simple ones that we wrestle with. How do I live as a Christian? How do I express my faith? Why do bad things happen? And what's the answer to this? And finally, the ultimate question we all face every day, today. What happens at death? Why do I die? Why is the world the way it's structured? And particularly in the 3rd and 4th century, these issues are being wrestled with, and different answers are coming up. And when I excavate a site that's destroyed by an earthquake in the mid-4th century, right as this transition is happening, and these people have to deal with this. They lose hundreds and hundreds of people are killed in the city. And many of them I know from the evidence archaeologically are Christian. So how do they deal with this tragedy, with this event? Is it even a tragedy, or is it a good thing? And this is the type of the questions that theologically they're wrestling with, impinged upon because of their daily lives.
Thank you. Now, as I said, 3 of these folk are practicing archaeologists. Maggot had his hand in the sand a little bit and thought he wants to read texts. So you might be excused from this next question if you so desire, but let me ask you folk this. And by the way, both Tom and Darlene and I all had the same archaeology teacher as undergrads at Wheaton College. And our teacher, Al Hurt, doesn't play a trumpet, he excavated a site in Nubia. And his lecture was called Christianity Comes to Nubia. He's digging a cemetery, and you have this pagan cemetery. Everybody's tomb is filled with pottery and jewelry and all kinds of goodies, which is what archaeologists are interested in. And then suddenly there's a break, and the tombs start to show nothing in them but human bodies. Christianity arrived. You can't take it with you. What are the ways that we see that Christianity changed the world that you all dig in? What are the things you see that says, aha, Christianity is here, I can see it in the dirt? We're so used to thinking just in terms of, well, I can read the Bible, I can read the book of Acts. But there's so much we don't know about the lives of Christians that we learn through archaeology. So, we'll start with Darlene, since you're up to your elbows in that sort of stuff, and we'll work this way, and then we'll let Maggot give a response from his textual side, because the texts themselves are an important witness to the coming of Christianity. So go ahead, Doc.
So this is a critical question of how do we know this, because it's often linked to that follow-up question, which is how soon did the world become Christian? And I think it comes in small ways. It comes with things such as wearing an amulet, wearing a necklace that has a cross, or having a ring that has a Christian symbol on it. It comes in naming of children. So, for example, from Egypt, we have papyri that have letters in which individuals have given their children Christian-sounding names or expressions or words like grace or peace, rather than the ancient Egyptian or the Hellenized Greek names. And so that's one of the ways that we can see it in terms of letters that are found in trash pits. We also can see it in terms of the decorations that people put in their homes. The Roman Egyptians used to have wall paintings of the Egyptian gods and goddesses on their walls. A very famous one is Isis nursing one of her sons. And later on, we can see that this is replaced with an image of Mary nursing Jesus. And so it was something that was very natural for Egyptians to understand that relationship between a mother and a child in Christianity. And so those kinds of things become very tangible within the home. And then, of course, we start to see eventually by the 5th century monumental church architecture, sometimes happening in the same place where the Egyptian temples were, but often in new places, in places that the Egyptians were no longer building. So there's some very big things, and then there's also very small things, and together they create a very complex portrait of how it starts to come together.
Yeah, the personal name side of things is very interesting, because this is something that throughout the Near East, even in the Bible, you can detect something of people's religious commitments based on the names they give their children. So that's a very important one. Yeah. Charles, what would you add to that?
Yeah, one of the first early Christian sites I've excavated when I was a student was in Ireland. And the whole transition from an Iron Age culture to a Christian culture almost took place within a 100-year period. And what happens is, in terms of burials, the Iron Age pagan culture would cremate their dead. And then with Christianity, they would bury their dead, and they would always they would orientate the human body literally, so it's oriented towards the sun, towards the east. And the reason why they did that was because in the book of Acts, when Jesus ascends into heaven, the angels say, as the Son of Man has gone up, is the way he's going to return. And so you bury the dead pointing to the east because of that promise that Jesus would return, and that was the symbol of eternal life, to be buried as a Christian. So within archaeology, we can really see this profound change in burial customs. And like Darlene said, we also start to see places that that were previously unsettled. All of a sudden, there's a little church there, and around that little church becomes a village. Usually, this is a monastic context throughout the Middle East. We see that in Ireland. We see that in early medieval France and in Spain. And so, what happens is, as Christianity is growing, they're moving away from the cities. The cities are a hub of evangelization, and then they're in a way running out of real estate and moving into the countryside. In fact, our term pagan comes from the Latin word paganus, which means people in the countryside. And that idea is that Christianity first started in the cities and then spread out into the countryside. And in the Middle Ages, there's still remnants of paganism out in the countryside. So I think that's how we see it in some ways in archaeology.
What do you see in Cyprus, Tom?
Well, as I said, I'm digging a site that is a frozen moment in time in the middle of the 4th century. In the cemetery associated with this site, you see this transition starting to occur. It's a mixed community. There are clearly pagan burials, and there are some that might be Christian. They're simply with nothing in them, or maybe occasionally personal jewelry, and that's it. In the city itself, where the earthquake hits, we found some sets of human remains of folk who were killed directly in the quake. And in one case, rather dramatically, there was a family that was next to a doorway. The mother was trying to protect a very young child. The father was trying to protect those two. and he's killed directly by a block that shattered his head. On his finger was a Christian ring with a Chi Rho on it and an Alpha Omega. We knew it wasn't just a political symbol. Sometimes the Chi Rho is a political one about Constantine. But with the Alpha and Omega, it's a Christian statement. And this is before Christianity is the only legal religion. This is when it's a mixed world. But here, dramatically and graphically, is a Christian family and the love of Christ, where the Father's protecting his family. So those are things that you encounter in archaeology like this, and it shows that shifting world. There's a mosaic floor from the site built very soon after the quake, which records that before the city had been protected by steel, diamond, and bronze. Now it's protected by the symbols of Christ. So right there on a floor, they're making a statement. Who they're going with now. Who's going to protect them? It's no longer Poseidon, no longer Apollo. It's going to be Christ.
Maggot, anything from your end of
I
things?
wanted to kind of tack on what Charles was mentioning regarding the reorientation, because that is important. In addition to the graves not having material objects, the whole bodies are reoriented now toward the east. It's really the foot towards the east and the head towards the west, with the idea that as the second coming is taking place and Christ is coming from the east, these individuals at the resurrection are standing up to receive him. And that, just as a kind of the last thoughts of somebody's life is important. Textually, of course, the spread is very well documented in that you find from the late 2nd to early 3rd century translations into Syriac, translations into Coptic and other languages, where initially everything is in Greek, and that works out great as long as Christianity is located in the Greek hubs, which are the cities. But as Christianity now extends into the countryside, excuse me, in Egypt, once you leave the Hellenic city and you go to the countryside, the population is speaking Coptic, various dialects, and hence the earliest translations into Coptic, and similarly in Syria with the Syriac language. And in itself, I think this is a very important testimony about the thought of early Christianity, because, and this has various manifestations in all later Christian traditions, but my reading of it is that early Christianity, when it comes to language, is extremely liberal. Even when you look at Egypt, not only did they translate from the Greek into Coptic, but they translate into various dialects, even dialects that are not all that different from one another. You can argue they were mutually comprehensible. The basic message was that whatever language you speak, even whatever dialect you speak, the words of the scriptures will be delivered to you in a language and an idiom that you fully comprehend, that you fully understand. Now, how to interpret, especially when it comes to theological issues, that I would kind of categorize according to a spectrum, but there is certain issues that when it comes to interpretation of theological passages, that's where kind of a lot of the disputes come in. But as far as presenting the words of the scripture to a population, even an illiterate population, as Dar was saying, it was always in a dialect, with the idea that when they meet at church, all you need is one person who is literate, because that person now is going to read it to the 100, 200, 500 who are in church, and they will hear the words of Scripture that way.
Okay. Now, I'm intrigued by the fact that in Egypt, you go to many of the great temples. And I'm sure many in this room have taken a tour of Egypt. If you go on somewhere like Karnak Temple, and you're looking up these huge pillars, and all of a sudden you see a painting on top of the hieroglyphs, and there's a haloed saint looking at you. And suddenly you realize, hey, this place had Christians in it at some point. What's going on there? Are we turning pagan temples into churches? Do we know what's going on with that sort of thing? And do we have something like that going on in your world? But let's start with Egypt. Yeah.
Well, Shunuti has Shunuti Batrip is a 5th century monastic in Upper Egypt who has a very long career. He lived for 112, 116 years or so, and it's these dates are often kind of circulated in early literature, and you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. Fortunately, in this case, Shenuti's career is very well documented, so we know with pretty good certainty that he definitely lived well over 100. And he delivers a sermon at the dedication of a temple that became a church. And much of the symbolism he is playing on is that whereas demons and death was worshipped before, now Christ, light, and life are now worshipped, with the idea that the Egyptian gods, according to much of the early monastic literature, the Egyptian gods are nothing more than deceptive demons who were kind of trapping the Egyptians in their mythology, with Christianity bringing the light of the truth. And hence there is something to the reclamation of these temples, but also the simple use of the material, which has a long, long history in Egypt, not only with Christianity, but prior with kind of looting older temples for newer ones, but especially later on with looting churches and monasteries to build mosques and the like, but a lot of cathedrals and monasteries. If you kind of look closely, you'll see building pieces of older temples. So they're reclaimed in some cases as is, and in other cases as building materials.
So, Dar, is this glorified recycling or is it triumphalism?
Yes, so that's a good question. And personally, I would side more with recycling, glorified recycling, because a lot of what you see is that the temples have gone into disuse. And so this is true throughout the Eastern Byzantine Empire, that these monumental structures that are made out of reliable stone, that are often with fully intact roofs, that it is prime real estate that is in fact not being used. And while there are some that are kind of hanging on, some of the temple complexes, it is something in which there's a practicality to the reuse of these monuments. And you can see it by, to use the example from Thutmose III's hall there at Karnak, where you have these images of saints at the top of the columns, still well preserved under a fully intact roof made of stone, that they are high up, and the floor level would be much higher than it is now, because archaeologists in the past purified the temple back down to its original floor level from the 18th dynasty. But when it was reused as a church, the floor level was much higher. And so that sense of what that space was used for, who was using it, has diminished. And we know also, if we use Shenouda again, we also know from him and other monastic writers that the ability to read any of these texts that were on the wall was lost. And so they had wild interpretations about what were the Egyptians saying and what did these things mean. And so they had available ideas in terms of seeing them as demons and seeing them as deceptors, but then the sense of presence, of sort of occupation, if you will, or displacement of demons just by the mere presence of Christians was something that was fairly prominent.
Okay. So interesting. So there's a sense of this is good, great building, it's standing, it's not being used, sort of become religious squatters. And okay, all right. Do everything like that going on in the Greek world, Cyprus, the gentleman here? Are you seeing that kind of thing going on in your world, or are things different there? Charles?
Well, let me just say one thing about Christianity. One thing that makes Christianity different from other religions is that when you read the New Testament, St. Paul is interpreting the entire Old Testament in the light of who Jesus was. So Jesus becomes the key of interpreting everything, all of nature, all of culture. And if you can take the Hebrew Bible and see it in a new light through the eyes of Christ, you can do that with any culture. You can go to the Egyptian culture and look at all their myths and all their religious structures and reinterpret those ideas in the light of Christ. You could do that in Persia. You can do that in Rome. You can do that everywhere. So, for example, I'm an art historian, so I have to use pictures. So let me just show you an example of this, something like this takes place. So in Egypt, you've all seen this symbol before. This is known as an ankh, and in Egypt, this is a symbol of life. Well, in Christianity, similar ideas are used for the name of Christ, the Chi-Rho, and the wreath that symbolizes the victory of Christianity. So it is a kind of triumphalism. And oftentimes that wreath is on top of a cross like this, and it looks very similar to an ankh like this. So if you go to some Coptic churches today, you might see the use of the ankh, which is the symbol of life. Now, you go to a pagan temple, it's pagan. But a Christian could look at this and say, this is pointing to the future when the truth of Christianity would come. And who is life? Well, Jesus said, I am the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. And that can be a symbol, or it can actually point to the cross and the victory of the cross. So I think Christians are actually reinterpreting their culture, their past culture, in the light of Christ, just like the Jewish Christians did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I thought you were going to pull a picture out where we have a number of ankh signs in Egyptian temples that have actually been touched and transformed into crosses.
Yeah.
And so they see that Christ is the key of life. He is the one that brings life, and it's through the cross and so on. Tom, anything in...
One thing to keep in mind is that Christians worship very differently than pagans in the Greek world. It is in the Greek world, the main place of worship, the main focus is that altar. And it's an individual exchange. You made a sacrifice on behalf of something or to the God for something. Christian worship is corporate. I mean, look at the space. It has to be big because people come to worship together. That's what we're instructed to do in the New Testament. That's how we're to worship. And that's a big transition. So the pagan temples often don't work physically for Christian worship. And in Cyprus, they have a clean slate. In the mid-4th century, a series of earthquakes destroys all the major pagan temples. And they're never rebuilt. Within the next generation, you see churches popping up, and by the 5th and 6th century, there's more than 200 on the island. But most of them, with the vast majority, are built in new places. They're built directly in the cities, or they're built on the shorelines, built in places where pagan temples are not, because the worship needs are fundamentally different than what you need for pagan worship. And also in Cyprus, it seems to me they sort of leave the temples there. They raid them for materials. They recycle them, as it were. But they're with only very rare occasions are they actually reused for Christian worship. This is in some ways peculiar to Cyprus because the nature of the earthquake history on Cyprus. But here's this catalyst from the natural world. They would, of course, see it as a supernatural catalyst, God intervening with an earthquake, or if you're a pagan, Poseidon shaking the world, that causes them to step back and say, wait a minute, we're going to be something different. And that's what you see physically in the landscape.
Okay. What I'd like to do is take a little bit of a diversion in a slightly different direction. And that is to get back to the origins of Christianity in the respective worlds represented here. And one of my great disappointments with the book of Acts is that it takes the gospel and it goes north and then into Europe. We need a book of Acts that goes from Jerusalem south and east. We don't have that. So this is where the secondary literature or the non-biblical literature comes in. This is where archaeology comes in, and so on. So beyond knowing, these are two things we do know from the book of Acts, and this is focused on Egypt now. Number one, that converts to Christianity came to Egypt shortly after Pentecost. Acts chapter 2 indicates that there were Egyptian Jews at Jerusalem who became Christians. F.F. Bruce, many, many years ago, suggested that probably those were the first to bring Christianity to Egypt. When we get later on in the book of Acts, chapter 18 or 19, suddenly there's this guy, I don't want to call him a traveling preacher, missionary, named Apollos, who's from Alexandria. And he's going off preaching in what is today Turkey. What's going on in those years between Pentecost and before we get to the end of the book of Acts? Can we say anything more about Christianity in Egypt in that first, say, from AD 50 to AD 100? What do we have? Anything? Or do we have to go to the 2nd century? What does it look like? What are the traditions in Egypt? Maggot, take it away.
Well, I mean, this is kind of one of the big problems in academia in general, trying to uncover what is happening in Egypt during that period. I think certainly Christianity comes to Egypt early. The pattern in the book of Acts is that Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah are going to various synagogues around the Mediterranean, telling their fellow Jews, hey, the Messiah is here. And Alexandria at that time had probably the largest Jewish population around the Mediterranean, save for Jerusalem, until the year 70. So the contact must have been early. We can prove that in various ways. Berger Pearson had done a great job in actually kind of unpacking the account of St. Mark, and which is often referred to as a legend and what have you. I mean, it's an account that goes back probably to the mid-2nd century. It's 3rd century documented. And there, it's clear that even though the account doesn't want to come out and say Christianity comes or starts off in the Jewish community because of later tensions between Christians and Jews, that implicitly it is there. The location that it names for the first church in Alexandria is in the middle of the exclusively Jewish quarter. The name of the first convert, Ananias or Hananiah, I mean, this is a Hebrew name, not a Greek name. This is one of those deals where the Hellenists would not name their son a Hebrew name, while many Hebrews or Jews would have double names or even Hellenic names. So even there, if we look at it just from the account of St. Mark, it still kind of points to Jewish origins of Alexandrian Christianity. Now, the gap that we have then kind of goes forward to the 2nd and 3rd century, where the debates about the nature of Christianity in Alexandria. And one of the slightly frustrating things is that even on a casual level, people know the Nag Hammadi library and the Gnostic material, and Gnosticism is definitely associated with Egypt. But there's two very important footnotes that need to be there, if not in the main text, if you will. One of them is that Gnosticism is not exclusively Christian. You do find Gnosticism in various other traditions, including Hellenic Gnosticism and Jewish Gnosticism. And the other is that you do have the Bodmer papyri, which are older and they're what we would identify as Orthodox. And if anything, they are closer to the monastery of St. Pachomius than the Nag Hammadi material, with some scholars arguing that the proximity has some meaning there. So it's clear that in Alexandria, even though you did have various schools of Gnosticism, you did have what we would recognize as mainline Orthodox Christianity that is abiding by the scriptures that we know. And the litmus test is often kind of the book of Psalms, where wherever you find the book of Psalms, you are finding kind of a mainline Christian group, not Gnostic, with Gnostics completely avoiding the book of Psalms.
Okay. Now, just to clarify a point there that may have not been realized by some of you, the Egyptian Coptic Church, the Orthodox Coptic Church of Egypt's tradition is that St. Mark is the initiator of the gospel. He brought the gospel to Egypt, and the line of patriarchs of Alexandria, or popes as they sometimes would call them, are in the line from St. Mark. Whereas in Rome, of course, the tradition is the line of popes go from Peter. So there is their own line of patriarchs, if you will. And so part of what I was getting at in my question is there seems to be a bit of a challenge of the tradition of Mark's role, and yet the limited evidence that Christianity, well, when would Mark have been there, other than the reference that Peter makes to Mark is with me in Babylon. Mm-hmm. I don't know, do you want to take that passage in Peter for us? Either of Dar, you?
Well, I was going to offer that we have from our first Christian historian, Eusebius, is the one who really gives us the foundational account of St. Mark as the founder. And of course, that's developing, and he's the biographer of Constantine's life and creating the sort of the first history of the church from Adam and Eve until his time, and seeing Constantine sort of as God's deliverer to bring the world out of paganism. And so he's very keen to identify how did Christianity start in various places. And of course, by taking us into the beginning of the 4th century, then we are fairly far away from this first century world that we're trying to sketch. I think one of the important things that Maggot brought up is the importance of how we understand Alexandria as a center. The city itself, we know archaeologically, was divided into 5 units. It was laid out a long time ago by Alexander the Great, according to, he had a dream in which he was guided to do this by the gods. But it's one of these most wonderful rectilinear plans in which there were districts for various individuals. And that allows us to have a great deal of archaeological material about the Jewish quarter. We have the writings of Philo in terms of his descriptions of the Jewish community. And we can see a world in which, again, to go back to one of my earlier comments about the intellectual richness of the Jewish community, to be ready to be introduced to the gospel, that there couldn't be a better place for that to in fact happen. And in fact, it's then by the beginning of the 2nd century that we have our first fragments of the New Testament come from Egypt. And so those pieces, while small, I think create a world in which we can get this sense of the spread of the gospel. And the last thing I would offer in terms of the archaeological perspective is that we have very little documentary evidence from Egypt's delta, which is where Alexandria is located. Most of our letters and our papyri and our archives come from Upper and Middle Egypt, and so that is a very strange representation due to the fact that we have a high water table in the north. So we are at a disadvantage. It's not because we haven't found things, it's because of the level of preservation in terms of those documents that may now be lost.
Yeah. That's a very good point. We, as archaeologists, often can only imagine what has been lost and what we don't have. And one of the great things about Egypt, of course, is much of what we do have in terms of papyrus comes from those desert areas outside of the Nile Valley where things stay dry. So a good example of this is how many famous documents were found either from the New Testament era or Old Testament era from Jerusalem? 0. How many documents do we have from Qumran in the desert near the Dead Sea? Tons. So environmental factors are really critical, and people often don't realize that. Well, why don't we have evidence about this? That's just the reality of archaeology. I want to hear from the Cyprus side of the table. So we have the tradition of St. Mark bringing the gospel to Egypt. We have a little different tradition in Cyprus.
Well, actually, I would point out that in Acts, there is a hint of part of the mission to Egypt. In Acts 15, look it up, there's a fight between Paul and Mark. They have a separation. Traditionally, that's seen as theology or something like that. The trade routes and recent work that shows us the connections of Cyprus to the rest of the world argue that it might be related to missionary strategy. The founding members of the church in Cyprus, or founding members of the church in Antioch, come from Cyrene and Cyprus. And the first mission journey of the church in Antioch starts on Cyprus. And it ends at a site called Paphos. Acts 13, you'll see where they encounter the Roman governor, and he's converted. You don't sail from Paphos to Anatolia, to Turkey. That's not how it works. You sail from Paphos to Egypt and North Africa. If you're going to sail to Turkey, you sail from the north. This is very clear from the pottery evidence and very clear from the way the trade routes and the currents work. Yet that's where Paul and Barnabas and Mark sail from, is Paphos to the north. I believe that their original mission trip has been diverted by the conversion of Sergius Paulus. He's a man from central Turkey. And the first place that they go to in Turkey, one of the cities is Pisidian Antioch, where Sergius Paulus' family came from. We know this from inscriptions that have been found there. It's quite likely that Sergius Paulus has given them a letter and said, "You've given me Christ, go to my family." And they get diverted. The normal trade routes are not there. The normal trading boats, they might even have taken a Roman imperial ship to get there. And Mark gets upset because he says, wait a minute, we were supposed to thank our spiritual parents, Cyprus and North Africa and Alexandria. And they don't go there. So he has a fight with Paul. And of course, where does he go eventually? Egypt. Now, that's speculative, but it's built on good data sequence. That's probably why they had a fight. So if that hadn't have happened, if the Spirit hadn't intervened and Sergius Paul's been converted, we might have an Acts record of the mission to Egypt.
Interesting. Thank you. Anything more on Cyprus and
Well,
early Christianity?
it's important to keep in mind that for the first, you could say, since when Christianity was legalized by Constantine, there was something called the Pentarchy, or the Rule of Five. There was 5 cities that had apostolic foundations. You had Rome with St. Peter, you had Alexandria with St. Mark, you had Jerusalem with St. James, you had Antioch with Peter again, and then you had they included Constantinople because it was the capital at the time. If there wasn't an earlier tradition of Mark being in Alexandria, then Alexandria wouldn't be accepted as one of the pentarchies, one of the churches that had this moral authority founded by one of the disciples. And so just that tradition itself gives credence to the idea, even though we might not have archaeological evidence, we do have this sort of political evidence that they saw this as a very, very early tradition. I also wanted to mention that, think about the Great Commission. One of the last charges Jesus gives the apostles is to go, therefore, preach the gospel, baptize all nations, go to Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. So we believe that the apostles did evangelize the Mediterranean region, but their disciples went out to the other parts of the world. We don't have, different regions have different traditions of how Christianity came to them. Both Tom and I work in Kazakhstan, and we work along the Silk Roads, and it's quite clear that Christianity, within a century, went into the Far East. There's a group of Christians in southern India called the St. Thomas Christians, and according to their tradition, St. Thomas the Apostle, doubting Thomas, ended up in India, and you go to their churches, they have their own traditions, and archaeology there is actually establishing this is a very, very early tradition. Before we thought this was a medieval presence, but now we're discovering that actually it has an earlier tradition. So it's something that archaeology can shed light on. The chances of finding a new book about the early Christian missionaries is probably 0, but archaeology, we can actually go in and dig up homes, dig up places, dig up graves, and come up with new data that will completely change how we write our history books.
All right, another little, yes, Maggie.
Oh, just a little footnote, just so that I'm not excommunicated when I get back home. I'm trying to walk a very fine line here. But just a St. Mark tradition, it's definitely within Eusebius, but textually it can be traced back to Julius Africanus and from there to Origen, and there's a very likely reference also in Clement, so that takes us well over a century prior to Eusebius.
Okay, well, thank you. You're going to hear more about Egyptian Christianity tomorrow night. Some of you know, maybe it's actually come out, but the oldest fragments of the New Testament were found in Egypt. Something else that Egypt gave the Christian world is monasticism. If you know any monks, their spiritual ancestors came from Egypt. So, Darlene and Maggot have spent time actually working in that world, discovering it, exposing it. Why did, what's behind monasticism? Tell us about Anthony and this whole movement and why it's significant and so on.
Okay. Well, that's a question that scholars ask all the time. So there's not an easy answer to that, but there are many answers, and they're all very interesting stories. So, of course, on the cynical side, there's the idea that there were all these Christians who decided to run away from paying their taxes. I don't know if anyone's felt like that during tax season, but that's really why people would stay in the desert for 40 years at a time, is just to avoid taxes. But that was one of the theories for a very long time. Another theory is that individuals that did this became mad, that Christians kind of lost their minds. And that had held sway for a long time because of our perception, I would say, as the scholarly world, about why people would live on the fringe, which is where a lot of these monastic communities were found. And yet, more studies, and in particular, what I have worked on recently, is calling into question that idea, so that St. Anthony is somebody who is not really the first father, although he gets the title of the first father, because his story was written about by a bishop from Alexandria. Athanasius writes this story about him. And there's lots of complications about why a bishop is telling the life story of this monk who is living by himself, and sort of his cult of personality, that people want to be near him and they want to benefit from him, and why Anthony then becomes such an important figure. But if you look at how Athanasius tells his story, Anthony actually seeks out another monk. He seeks out some other man who has started to live on the fringe of a property by himself. And so the monastic movement, when we look at it sort of with a broader historical lens, is one in which we see trends of Christians asking themselves, how do I live? How do I follow God in a world in which I can no longer offer myself for martyrdom? How do I show my devotion to God? And how do I separate myself from the noise of my family, or the noise of the obligation to have to get married or have to have children? Can I have a life where I live alone, just in devotion to God? And then this becomes a very popular choice because it allows for individuals, both men and women, to live in communities with their own gender, and to pursue their passion for God with other like-minded people. And in order to do that, you have to live in a new place. You have to sometimes separate yourself. You have to run away from your family sometimes. We have stories of monks, both men and women, running away, and their family members desperately hunting them down at monasteries, saying, is my child hanging out here? And so there was a real kind of passion for some of these things. But it was also a space in which you could pursue your intellectual life. So monasticism attracted both the very poor and the very wealthy, and everybody in between. And so there's a longevity to that attraction that's not just in Egypt, but it sort of develops in the Eastern Mediterranean sort of simultaneously.
Please add to that, Magid, what you like, but I would also like you to, in addition, to tell us a little bit about, is monasticism alive and well in Egypt today? Is it still functioning?
Well, to continue with what Dar started off, I mean, it's definitely a phenomenon in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the evidence for Egypt and Syria is neck and neck. Palestine comes in a little bit later. And scholars do argue that, Anthony wasn't the first, but it's clear that even among that first generation, Anthony does cast a very long shadow. In general, I think it's important to view monasticism as both something old and something new. One of the things that is often overlooked, especially kind of in contemporary Christianity, is that early Christianity does have a very strong ascetic streak. All-night vigils, remaining celibate for an individual's whole life, fasting for long periods of time. These are not things that were invented per se for Christian monasticism. These were things that can be traced much earlier. What is unique with Christian monasticism, and what Anthony kind of gets credit for, rightly or wrongly, is kind of combining this with this notion of retreat also, that you are kind of now being segregated to some extent from the world, which oftentimes is actually much more ideological than actual. A lot of monasteries are clearly in contact with the nearby villages, with nearby fields and the like. We mentioned Shinuti, the 5th century monastic figure, a little bit earlier. And Shinuti, every Sunday, he would have the villagers coming and hearing his sermons after the liturgy. There is something, once you kind of get into this notion that your Christianity has these aspects already existing there, and not to get overly romantic, but there is something about the simplicity of simply working and praying and offering one's whole being to God. I mean, even the monks, not all of them lived up to all of the great expectations, but even their work, the way they kind of perceived work was important as a means to an end. I mean, it fulfills a biblical prophecy, St. Paul, whoever doesn't work should not eat. But in providing for themselves, especially in the Egyptian context, it was front and center that what they earn, they provide for themselves, so they are not a burden to anybody, but also that a significant portion of that, anywhere from 2/3 to at least a half, is given away to charity. And one of the ideas behind work is that how am I going to provide for widows and orphans if I don't have an income? I need to work in order to be able to give charity. And the merging of work and prayer together, so that there is a simplicity there that, and again, the notion of offering all of this voluntarily to God as a personal sacrifice. There is something to it. As far as today, definitely in Egypt, there's been a monastic revival since the 1960s. The numbers, I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but in many cases they're almost tenfold, where you have monasteries that had 3 or 4 old monks now having 80 or 90 monks. The largest ones tend to be those in Wadi Natrun, which is kind of ancient Sketis, right in the heart of the delta, I guess.
It's between Alexandria and Cairo in the desert, yeah.
And you have, the writing of the late Pope Shenouda, who was patriarch for well over 40 years, popularized the idea. But also the writings of Father Metta Meskin, Matthew the Poor, who is may not be kind of a known commodity to in the West, but those that are kind of into monastic studies and current monastic spirituality. Father Matthew the Poor is one of the main monastic authors, and you can kind of see the fruit, if you will, of a monk who's been working his whole life simply reading the scriptures and kind of immersing himself in the patristic heritage. But currently, yeah, the number of monks in Egypt is perhaps one of the largest, maybe even before the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So one thing I would add to this, too, is Megan mentioned that this is not, in some ways, necessarily a new way of living. And that's true when we look at the form of asceticism that was being practiced by the Neoplatonists in Alexandria, and especially when we look at athletes within the Greco-Roman world, that some of the same terms that are used to describe those who are following philosophical lives are the same terms that are used to talk about monks in terms of how do they practice, how do they control their body. The Stoics have very similar habits in terms of how do they eat, how do they sleep, how do they have feelings or not have feelings. So the way of living has very concrete parallels to earlier communities that set themselves apart. And so when we think about, was monasticism kind of a new idea for those who were not practicing it, I'm not sure it would have been as new as it is to us as modern readers, where we're not seeing that kind of disciplined lifestyle as much around us. That monasticism may, in fact, have been a very natural thing to develop within the Christian community because of those parallels.
I mean, the only thing I would add is that within a Christian context, however, all of these ideas, even the ones that are coming from Greco-Roman philosophy, were always Christianized. I mean, even when you look at the Stoic philosophers and kind of the ultimate aim of being without any passion, without any need. Within monastic literature, it always came up just short of that. You have an account with John the Little, where John keeps on praying, God, take away all my temptations, take away all my passions, and he is said to have been granted that gift, and then he goes out, he comes back to the cell, and he was sharing the cell with his brother, in this case an actual monastic brother and a blood brother. He had an older brother. And his older brother wouldn't open to him, and he'd tell him, why aren't you opening? It's me, it's John. And his brother told him, no, I don't recognize you. God, I think you should go and pray to God to return the passions to you, because how else are you going to make progress in this world? How else are you going to be tested and proven? Those who are beyond temptation are the angels, and if you aren't an angel, you no longer live here.
Anything about monasticism from your world?
Yeah,
or
I would just add to this is it's important to keep in mind that when you read the New Testament, it talks about the family of God. That when you become a Christian, you have your natural family, but when you become a Christian, you become part of a supernatural family. And Jesus talked to God the Father as Abba. Well, in these monastic communities that arise, the head of the monastery in Egypt would be called Abu, and in the West he would become an abbot, and the nuns would become sisters and mothers, and the brothers and fathers. This kind of familial language starts to develop within these communities. So monasticism, in a way, is a new kind of family. It's a Christian family. It's about working together for the common good of the community. And in a sense, if any of you belong to a church, your community, your congregation, is a kind of a monastic community where you're all helping each other become better Christians. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And another important idea here is that these communities were predicated on the idea that they believed the end time would be soon, and they needed to group together and protect each other from persecution as well. And so to separate yourself from the world was also in a way of protecting yourself from your spiritual and physical enemies as well.
Anything from you, Tom, on this subject?
On Cyprus, you don't really see the monastic space happening until the Middle Ages. It's actually when the church comes under threat of first Islamic domination with the Arab raids and Arab conquest in the 7th century. And then from the Greek perspective, when the Latin Crusaders come, do you see the flourishing of the monasteries up in the mountains? They pull out of the cities, the Orthodox Church, and go into the mountains. And that becomes the salvation space for Christianity and for Greek culture. So it should be no surprise to us that the first president of independent Cyprus is a monk, Archbishop Mikhail.
Interesting. Yeah. I have two major lines of questioning and discussion in our last 20 minutes. Many of you know, because you hear it in the news, of ongoing attacks, especially against Christians in the Middle East, and very often you hear about things happening in Egypt to Christians. I'm intrigued by the fact that when Islam came to North Africa, that Christianity was wiped out all across North Africa, which was all Christian in the 7th century, pretty much. But it survived in Egypt. From Libya all the way to Morocco, again, remember, that's St. Augustine country. Christianity was well established for hundreds of years. But Christianity disappears from the rest of North Africa, but it survives in Egypt. I asked that question to the last Pope of the Coptic Church, Pope Shenouda, but I'm not going to give you his answer. I want to hear what you think, any of you on the panel. Why did Christianity survive in Egypt? But why was it then, or why did it not survive in the rest of North Africa?
That's an excellent question. I mean, it can be looked at from several perspectives. There is the smart aleck response. Copts are stubborn. They're very stubborn.
Yeah, for clarification, the word Copt simply means Egyptian. Okay, the word Egypt, Copt, okay, that word derives from the old name of the temple of the god Ptah in the capital city of Memphis. The temple was called Hukupta, Auguptus, Egypt. So Copt, every time you say that, you're referring to a pagan deity named Ptah. So, but anyway.
Yeah, but from the Arab conquest on, it's really kind of Egyptian, and then because most of Egypt was Christian, it becomes synonymous with the Egyptian Christians. It can be looked at from a biblical perspective. I mean, you have the patristic interpretation of Isaiah that there will be an altar for the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and it cannot be a Jewish altar, of course, and it's, since the patristic era has been understood as a Christian altar, and hence that testimony has to be there. There is something to be said for, oddly enough, in my mind, the generations that lived in the 13th, especially the 1400s. Because in my mind, what really kind of makes Christianity in Egypt survive until today is the perseverance of those generations. Because this was one of the darkest points in history for Christians in Egypt. Much in Egypt was going the wrong way to begin with. The economy was in decline. There's tremendous political violence and uproar, which affected all Egyptians, Muslims, and Christians alike. But throughout that period, the Christians were habitually scapegoated for all the problems. This was where you find, incidents of mob violence and the burning of churches and the looting and burning of Christian quarters in the city every 5 to 7 years. This is the period where you find the discriminatory edicts constantly being reissued, what are called the debasement regulations in Islam, those that not only increase the jizya tax and the like, but the ones that decree that Christians and Jews cannot ride horses or cannot ride a donkey when there's a Muslim present, or that the men have to ride side saddle. They are not to ride animals as their Muslim peers. They have to have their heads lower than the tax collector. And a whole host of edicts that are just meant intentionally so to make it difficult for Christians and Jews to survive in Egypt. And Egypt has always had a significant Jewish minority until Nasser and the modern era. And just kind of putting up with all of that. It comes down, in my mind, to that generation.
Okay. Dar, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, when I think if we have the wide expanse of North Africa in the West has its own challenges with the Vandals, and they experience a very different type of challenge that then is followed very quickly on the heels of the Islamic conquest. And I think that there is greater disruption that takes place in the West versus the continuity in the East. And I do think a lot of it has to do with the strength of the Byzantine Empire as the Muslim world starts to slowly take over the southern provinces. And that continuity, from my perspective as a historian, when I look at this question, is that the Muslims learn from their Byzantine partners about how to rule and how to manage diverse empires. One of the, if anything, the greatest achievement of the Islamic world is the fact that they so quickly established an empire without a lot of significant experience with how to do that. And so I think that Egypt itself, because of its own infrastructure, is something that allowed for the preservation of Christianity and the thriving of monasticism in a space in which it could not have happened elsewhere. And I think that's also why Syrian Christians, for example, found such kinship with their Egyptian partners, in part for how they shared a common theology as well. But I think that experience of living under Muslim leadership allowed for their communities to thrive in a way that was not possible in the Western sections.
I could add something. There's a Cypriot saint named John the Almoner. He's from Amathus, a site on Cyprus. A little stiff. And he, it happens with archaeologists and these. But he is becomes the archbishop or the bishop of the Orthodox Church in Alexandria. And this is right before in the early part of the 7th century, about a generation before Islamic conquest. And he shows up, and it's a very rich church, it's a very rich sea. It has ships, it has merchants, it has... this is told in his story, so we don't know truly if this is true or not, it's his hagiography. But he shows up and he says at the first meeting of his churchmen, "I passed Christ on the way here and you're not taking care of him." He passed a beggar in the street. And he insists that the church sell half of its property and get involved in caring for the poor and caring for the downtrodden, caring in the prisons, in the hospitals, building hospitals. And according to the hagiography story, again, this is a Cypriot version of this, when he comes, there's 4 active, he leaves hundreds of churches newly founded because of his witness as to what a Christian truly is. So to the Middle Byzantine world, looking on that, they saw the survival because of the witness that the church was. Again, it's an outsider's perspective. It's interesting.
Charles?
And it's also possible that Christianity didn't die out in North Africa. We just don't have any text that supplies information about these Christian communities that might have survived. What we're discovering in the Central Asia is that Christianity continued in Persia and in Central Asia up until the 16th century. One of the big blows of Christianity was the plague, killed off many people, and then later on Tamerlane came through and just massacred everybody, not just Christians, but the entire populations. And so it's very possible that Christianity actually survived in North Africa into the Middle Ages, and then later, perhaps because of Wahhabism, you start to see in the modern period the decline of Christianity, especially within the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire wasn't very good for Christian communities in the Middle East.
Oh, thank you. Do you want to hear Pope Shenouda's answer to my question?
Yes.
I was surprised by his answer, but the more I've thought about it, you hinted at it earlier. He says, I say, why did Christianity survive in Egypt? And he says, because Jesus came to Egypt. Isn't that interesting? Jesus took Egypt and Africa seriously. We take Jesus seriously. What do you think of that answer?
No, the altar in the middle, I mean, that's one of the traditional spots for the pilgrimage of the Holy Family in Egypt.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Last subject, and then feel free if there's time to question each other. What we've just touched on, very briefly here, is the issue of Christians and how they have suffered, been martyred, really, well, in Egypt certainly since what, about 2002, Septimus Severus, era of Diocletian, and then on, ever since Roman times, Christians have suffered, martyred. And one of the things I think the church in the Middle East has developed is a really good doctrine of suffering. We're not very good about suffering over here. We don't like suffering. I don't like suffering. Who does? But maybe you could touch a little bit on that aspect of suffering, martyrdom, and how that itself becomes a strengthening element for the Christian community really to this day, really, not just in the early centuries.
Well, I can share that. So I worked for the Yale Monastic Archaeology Project, and I was their field director for 2 excavations and now a senior consultant for them. And my last visit to Egypt, my last visits to Egypt have been after the ousting of President Mubarak, and in a world of the Arab Spring, there's a great sense in Egypt of Copts having an awareness that death is imminent. And of course, probably you've heard about the execution of Egyptians in Libya, and that they are being considered saints for their suffering. And I have the privilege to have teams of Egyptian workmen who work as our day laborers, and we select specifically from Coptic communities. And what I have learned in talking with them and with seeing them as well is that they now prominently wear a cross on their neck. So Copts often have a tattoo, they have some kind of physical symbol, but now they are wearing even more visible signs of their faith in the real belief that they are going to die soon. And that is something that is very much a reminder of a different world and a different Christianity than the Christianity that I have, in terms of the fact that I don't have a constant fear that I might die because of the beliefs that I have, and how proud they are to be expressing that faith, that I'm willing to die and I will wear the symbol so that I am selected. And so that is certainly much more present in a way that I had not experienced it with my Coptic colleagues until after this Arab Spring.
I think in general, just martyrdom across the ages. There's always been the mentality that the martyr is selected for a special witness, kind of the literal meaning of a martyr, kind of providing a witness. And even from the early persecutions down through the Great Persecution down until today, there's this notion that unfortunately oftentimes it's the gruesome details that get the attention. Whether it's during the Great Persecution, how many times had this individual been to the rack, or how they've been limbs have been hacked off, or what have you. But when you actually look at these texts, as fantastic as many of them are, there's always that witness. There's always that encounter between the martyr and the authority is tempting them to give up their Christianity, give up and preserve their life, and they provide that witness of saying, no, I've been selected for this. I've been chosen to suffer as Christ. And you find this in the Greek material, the Coptic material, the medieval Arabic martyrdoms, and the modern accounts today with, Dar mentioned the Libyan martyrs. The Libyan martyrs, in the U.S. media, you just saw like little frozen images, and it was kind of a 2-3 minute thing on the news. The details that came up afterwards is that all of them were asked to give up their faith. All of them were asked that we'll let you live if you renege your Christianity and say the Shahada and become Muslims. And within Islamic jurisdiction, or the schools of thought, that has to be repeated 3 times. It's not just enough to make that offer to a person once. You have to repeat it 3 times. They have to give you the same answer 3 times, and then you can kill them or execute them. So those martyrs, they are contemporary, but they still fit within this larger pattern of martyrdom within Christianity at large, but within Egyptian Christianity in particular.
Tom?
Just a couple things. In the 7th century, there was major Arab raids on Cyprus and some settlement, and one of the churches was burned up in Saloi. And the bishop wrote an inscription, which we actually have. And in this inscription, he mentions the judgment of God is balanced with his mercy. Mm-hmm. And his judgment is not without mercy, and his mercy is not without judgment. Mm-hmm. And that was what they hung on to through martyrdom. That appreciation for this balance in God. In a modern setting, with work we've been doing in Kazakhstan, we found the first physical evidence, the earliest physical evidence of Christianity in Kazakhstan. And to the local believers, current believers, this was liberating, because they could now say to their Kazakh brethren, you can no longer say I'm not being a Cossack if I'm a Christian. And because this predates Russian imperialism, predates Russian Christianity. It was Cossack Christianity. And this grounding of it into the real world through the archaeology has been liberating for them.
Charles, I'll give you the last word.
Sure. A couple of months ago, I think it was February 24th, there was monuments all over the world that were bathed in red light. The Colosseum in Rome, Notre Dame of Paris, churches in Syria. And it was to mark the fact that over the past 10 years, it seems that 100,000 Christians have given their lives for their faith around the world. That means 2 million people over the past 10 years have died for their faith. In fact, the past 10 years have been the worst time of Christian persecution that the world has seen, simply because there's more Christians in the world today than there has ever been before. It's important to keep in mind that the very first Christian who died was Jesus. He died for his faith, and then the apostles also died, except for St. John. They died. Remember, the term martyr means witness. They bear testimony to the faith that they have. In a sense, all of us who claim to be Christians, we have to go through a kind of witness, a martyrdom. It could be physical. It could be social. There's a kind of stigma, professional, believe me. As academics working in the secular world, we get persecuted for our belief in Christ. So it's just part of being Christian, simply because if you're going to follow Christ, you have to follow his example. And we carry the cross on our shoulders every day, following his example.
Well, thank you, each one of you, for your participation. I just want to wrap this up by saying, hopefully this has given you some sense of the legacy that we as 20th century North American Christians have to look back on. There's so much we can learn from those brothers and sisters who went before, many of whom who paid the ultimate price, and also hopefully in your thoughts would be to be much more considerate and prayerful of Christians who today are suffering around the world for their faith in the Middle East, parts of Africa, Asia, and so on. So hopefully this has given you a little taste of the rich legacy that is ours. And please come back tomorrow night to hear more from Darlene Brooks Hedstrom about her work and the search for Christianity in Egypt. So thanks again, each of you, for participating, for you for coming. And why don't we just conclude by giving them our applause. Thank you.